Kelly Taylor. Chapter 4. Launched. Sylvie had never beheld Maître Bourgeot more nervously irritable than on the morning of the eventful day when her powers were to be gauged before the tribunal of public taste. Now he declared that she sang as though her heart were ice, and her voice frosty air. Anon he complained that she exaggerated. She was too florid, too fiery, too dramatic. When she became embarrassed by these unusual criticisms, he charged her with affectation and wounded vanity. Heretofore, his instructions had never alluded to the absence or presence of emotion, but had developed her magnificent voice and perfected her fine ear, as though he ignored that they were instruments for the soul's melodious expression. She had been wholly unconscious of the depth of feeling that often found utterance upon her lips. Its manifestations was unpremeditated and untutored. Maître Bourgeot's pitiless chiding now inspired her with a strong dread that he had overrated her talents, and her heart sank until she grew deadly sick, and then it seemed to mount into her throat and stifle the swelling notes. This was the first time that her noble organ had been impaired by the least approach to huskiness. Maître Bourgeot, in almost frantic amazement, ceased playing to dive into his snuff-box, and, having nearly impeded his respiration with its stimulating contents, he sought comfort in torturing his moustache with tugs which threatened its total uprooting. He found further relief in roundly scolding Sylvie for her lack of composure, without once suspecting that he himself had destroyed her mental equilibrium. The young girl made no reply, but her whole frame shook with repressed agitation. "Premonitory symptoms of hysteric as I live! I know the signs and foresee what's coming," cried the teacher, scanning her with indignant glances. "If we are to be indulged with a hysterical farce tonight, I'm ruined, that's all." And he doggedly closed the piano and rose from his seat. Sylvie strove in vain to choke down a sob. Maître Bourgeot responded to it with a fierce growl, and ordered her to sing no more that day, and not to weary herself with exertion of any kind, yet not to lie down for fear of clogging her voice, and not to eat, except very sparingly, and then hurried out of the room. The two last were the most superfluous commands. She was a stranger to the luxurious habit of reposing when the sun was up, and the frugal fare of poverty was not likely to pamper her appetite. The white dress was completed some hours before it was needed. Madame de la Roche sat beside the bed where it lay, smoothing out the folds and mourning over the recollections it awakened of her happy maidenhood, when she had worn just such attire, while Ursule constantly interrupted her reminiscences by suggestions for improvement of Sylvie's severely simple toilette. "A little simple jewelry is really indispensable. It will keep people from suspecting that she is so very poor. Have you no ornaments, no trinkets?" As may be imagined, the answer was in the negative. "And have you nothing to wear in your hair, Sylvie? Something bright might improve your looks." "I fear not," replied Sylvie quietly, "and I would rather not try the experiment. Maître Bourgeot would tell you that my looks are a hopeless case, and today my heart is hardly full enough of hope to contradict them." The kind dressmaker was not satisfied. She went to her own apartment and hunted over all the humble treasures she had hoarded up for years. By and by, she returned with a cache-pin, a breast-knot full of scarlet ribbons she had herself worn upon festive occasions long, long ago, before the snow of life's winter fell upon her hair and the chill of disappointment on her heart. She had also brought a large cameo brooch, the setting of very doubtful gold, and the cutting very undoubtedly execrable. Also a large buckle, and a pair of very barbarous-looking gold hoops for the ears, which she declared would give great character to Sylvie's face. Sylvie's ears had been pierced in her childhood, but her juvenile earrings of bright red coral had long since been converted into bread. Sylvie was very loath to wound her warm-hearted friend, but good taste prompted her to reject the grotesque-looking additions to her attire. Ursule next insisted upon displaying her skill as a hairdresser, and what combing and brushing and braiding Sylvie's abundant tresses underwent. An hour was consumed in the task. Then the fiery cachepeigne was fastened over those shining braids, and Ursule declared that her labors had produced a marvelous result. Sylvie glanced in the small mirror which Ursule triumphantly held up before her, and could not admitting that her coiffure spoke the exact truth. The effect of her handiwork was so marvelous that the young girl hardly recognized her own countenance. The mirror seemed mockingly to reflect some ludicrous caricature of the face she had been accustomed to see. When she involuntarily raised her hand to remove the hideous red bows, which covered not only her hair, but half her head, Ursule pleaded so hard that they might remain undisturbed, that Sylvie hesitated, and rather than cause her zealous friend mortification, came very near relenting. Just then a timid knock called Madame de la Roche to the door. The hunchback stood without. "They say that Madame Sylvie is going to sing at Count Castellan's tonight. She'll want flowers. All grand ladies wear flowers. Nanette spared me these. Begged Mademoiselle Sylvie to wear them." He handed the mother a small bunch of June roses and hastened away. The roses were just what Sylvie would have desired, had she been accustomed to wish for anything that seemed unattainable. The flaming cachepeigne was quickly discarded. The delicate-hued roses, with their vivid green leaves tastefully disposed among her glossy dark hair, gave to the arrangement of her head a picturesque effect that wonderfully improved her countenance. The white muslin dress fitted her admirably. Sylvie's neck and arms lacked the beauty of roundness, but the artful dressmaker had only disclosed them beneath a transparent covering which concealed their thinness, without hiding the graceful fall of the shoulders and the gentle curve of the youthful bust. Ursule took up the mammoth brooch, with the evident hope of fastening it in Sylvie's bosom, but the latter smilingly frustrated her intention by placing one of the June roses in the breast. The brooch was relinquished, and the huge buckle proffered, but Sylvie mildly set it aside, and arranged her white sash very neatly with a few unseen pins. The earrings alone remained, and Ursule so pertinaciously urged their adoption that Sylvie found it difficult to defend herself from being forced to assume the barbarous appendages. In spite of her predilection for finery and her discomfiture at the rejection of her precious gewgaws, when Ursule paused to contemplate the young singer, apparelled in virginal white raiment, with the June roses in her hair and on her bosom, she frankly acknowledged that any ornament would have destroyed the maidenly simplicity, the striking spirituality of her appearance. The hour at which Maître Beaujeu had promised to call for his pupil was approaching. The Count de Castellane resided in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, at some distance from the lodgings of the debutante and her master. But there was no money left for the hire of a fiacre. They were obliged to walk. "What is Sylvie to wear over her dress?" "We have nothing, positively nothing," exclaimed the mother. "This faded mantle of hers will never do, never, and I have only a worn-out grey shawl. What is she to wear? And on her head, too? She has nothing to wear but her old straw bonnet, and that is only too shabby. But it would crush those flowers and disarrange her hair." Madame de la Roche had discovered a new difficulty, and it really seemed as though, through habit, she had seized with avidity upon each fresh obstacle. Before she ceased speaking, Ursule was out of the room. In a few moments she reappeared, with a somewhat rusty black silk mantilla on her arm. "There, that's something quite respectable. I've worn it for these 10 years on Sundays and holidays, but it has always been in fashion, and no one can turn up their noses at black silk. It's always genteel." "But her head, what about her head?" cried the mother. "Well, for her head, I do not think I can arrange quite so nicely. We'll have to manage about that. I have no sort of evening headgear, for I don't go out at night. I have no one to accompany me," she added with a little sigh. "A hat is out of the question, or I might lend her my green silk bonnet with the scarlet poppies, but it would not do, so I bought this for a substitute, and we must make it answer." As she spoke, she flung over Sylvie's head and fastened lightly under her chin a very old black veil of imitation lace, carefully darned here and there, yet not without rents, which there was no time to repair. "There, it's charming, quite Spanish in its effect, I declare, and it won't press upon the flowers. I assure you it don't look at all out of the way. In some countries veils are always worn in the streets. To be sure, people don't fasten them on just in this style, but what does that signify?" Maître Beaujeu now made his appearance, looking more quaint than ever in the full dress suit which he had preserved for so many years that it had a come-out-of-the-ark sort of cut and air. "What? You're ready, young one? That's right, I like punctuality. I hope we have no hysterics. There, don't begin to look frightened. We don't want to talk about such stuff. We must be off, for it's a long night, and if you are hurried or flurried tonight, your voice will suffer." "Can we not wait a moment or two to give her father a chance of seeing her?" besought Madame de la Roche. "He said he would be home in time, but he had some copying engaged for today, and I suppose he could not get through as early as he intended." The very possibility of Monsieur de la Roche's appearance was enough to speed Maître Beaujeu. No, we are going this instant," and he snatched Sylvie's hand away from Ursule, who was fastening her glove. "Let's be off, and carry that nightingale safely in your throat, or you and I will both be undone tonight." "Oh, don't mention it," sighed Madame de la Roche, putting her handkerchief to her eyes. "It's just what I expect." "Then, begging your pardon, you're I won't say what you are," answered Beaujeu bluntly. "Don't you suppose that I know what I'm about? Do you imagine that I would risk my own reputation with such a pompous fellow as Legrand? Come, let's be off before I get into a passion." How those words, rude as they were, consoled and encouraged Sylvie, who had been struggling all day with her doubts. She embraced her mother tenderly, saying, "All will be well with me, mother. Have no fear. My voice was not given to me for nothing, and—" "Is this sermon going to end soon?" shouted the impatient old man. "When did you turn into a preacher, Scarecrow? Your voice was not designed for the pulpit, but the choir." Sylvie turned to Ursule, murmured her thanks, kissed her, and followed her master. In quitting the room, he nearly came in contact with Mathieu, who was watching the door. Rougeau lifted his hand to strike the boy, but Sylvie caught the upraised arm. Don't! I wasn't doing anything, cried Mathieu. I only wanted to see Mademoiselle Sylvie as she passed, and to know if she wore my roses. Yes, Mathieu, yes, I have them in my hair and on my bosom. She hastily lifted her veil as she spoke, and threw back the old black mantilla that he might see the flowers. His look of beaming delight made her heart glow, and she thought, what a simple thing can give pleasure to the very poor, very humble, very pleasureless. It is almost worth while being poor to need so little to make one happy. The walk to the hotel of the Count Castellane was long, and Maître Beaujeu preserved silence which Sylvie felt no disposition to break. At any other time she might have enjoyed the sight of the gaily illuminated streets and the brilliantly lighted shop windows, which she seldom beheld, but now she saw nothing save the clear blue sky and the stars above her, thought of nothing but high purposes and heavenly aid. They passed through a spacious courtyard, and the door of the stately mansion was quickly thrown open. Monsieur Legrand, is he here? Has he come yet? Inquired Beaujeu of a domestic. I believe so, monsieur. Have the goodness to show me to him. The servant led the way to the library. By a table, poring over some leaves of music, sat a pompous-looking old man, attired at the height of fashion. His dyed beard and hair lent no counterfeited youth to his deeply furrowed face. He turned as the door opened. His air was unquestionably consequential and patronizing. "Oh, Beaujeu, my friend, is that you? Glad you're early," he exclaimed in a condescending tone. "Is this the young person you thought competent to take the place of Mademoiselle Beauchasse and fill that unfortunate hiatus by singing with La Blanche?" He scrutinized poor Sylvie with a mistrustful expression, which increased the nervous trepidation from which she was already suffering, then whispered, still glancing doubtfully at her, "Do you really think she is equal to the Semiramide?" "Monsieur Legrand," answered Beaujeu, with a dignity which Sylvie had never before seen in him assume, "I am no pretender. I am an artist, as you yourself are. I have never had your opportunities or met with your successes, all the worse for me, but I have some reputation to lose, and have not quite as much to spare as you have. My loss would be all the heavier if I committed a faux pas. I should not have recommended my pupil, Mademoiselle Sylvie de la Roche, were I not quite certain of her powers." Sylvie began to wish that he had been less confident, or that he would speak with less certainty, and promise less, for cold shudders ran through her frame. She felt as though her voice were stifled, her blood frozen, and if all her limbs had suddenly lost their sinews. She could hardly help exclaiming, "Oh, my master, you have overrated me. I shall never be able to sing before an audience, especially if the people resemble this gentleman." She turned to Beaujeu with words surging up to her lips. One look revealed that he only preserved his calmness through a mighty effort, that his composure and apparent faith in her success was assumed. The hand in which he held his old horn box shook and scattered its contents. He blew his nose violently, either to appear at ease or to conceal his countenance, and when that prolonged process was over, how the poor moustache was twirled and twisted and martyrized! Sylvie saw that he was, in reality, fearful of failure. Her downcast eyes rested on her snowy dress, and she thought of the sacrificed violin. "I beg pardon, I did not mean to offend," said Legrand coldly. "I referred only to the extreme youth of the young lady. Her appearance made me question." Maître Beaujeu interrupted him. "Monsieur, I did not tell you that her appearance was prepossessing. Did you ever see the plumage of a nightingale? Parrots and peacocks have gaudy feathers, but the nightingale carries the divine music beneath a rusty coat of brown. The performers of both sexes now began to pour in. Monsieur Legrand saluted each, in turn, in the most courteous manner. The ladies were robed in ball costume, and there was a lavish display of satins, brocades, embroidered tulle, flashing diamonds, artificial flowers, floating feathers, and all the accessories of the most elaborate toilettes. Sylvie's white muslin and June roses looked strangely insignificant and out of place beside their gorgeous attire. As they threw off their rich mantles, they cast upon her glances of disdainful surprise and whispered to each other. The men looked at her hardly less rudely, turning away with a shrug which said, "She's no beauty." Maître Beaujeu, perceiving how Sylvie shook, almost forced her into a seat, and stood beside her chair as though to shield her from the impertinence to which she was exposed. Last of all entered La Blanche. Monsieur Legrand immediately presented him to Sylvie and her instructor. The latter was quite prepared for some expression of disapprobation when the distinguished Basso beheld the lowly-looking substitute who had been chosen to fill the place of Mademoiselle Bellechasse, but La Blanche hardly bestowed a glance upon Sylvie. It was a matter of very little importance to him in what manner she executed her share of the music. He regarded her merely as a necessary auxiliary to enable him to display his wonderful powers in a duet which had been ordered by a member of the royal family as an express compliment to himself. The tuning and trying of instruments filled up a long interval. At last, Monsieur Legrand, who had left the room, returned and said with emphasis, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you are all ready, have the goodness to accompany me." Sylvie, as she perceived the general movement, rose from her chair, but the next instant sank down again. For a moment the lids dropped heavily over her eyes, and her naturally sallow complexion grew almost livid. Maître Beaujeu seized her arm and whispered, "Do you intend to disgrace me before all these people? For the love of heaven, rouse yourself! You can if you will. I say you must. You shall." She slowly opened her eyes and regarded him with a vacant stare, as though she could hardly comprehend his words. "Sylvie, don't you hear me? Why don't you answer? See, they have all gone. We shall be missed." The room was by this time empty. Maître Beaujeu glanced over the program he held in his hand and whispered, "Courage, child, courage! Your turn does not come for some time. You are fully equal to the occasion if you can only collect yourself. Courage, dear child!" How kindly his voice sounded! Sylvie could not recognize the tone, and gentle words always had such power over her. They now seemed to communicate strength, to renew vitality, to quicken and exalt all her faculties. Nothing could have restored her more effectively than words of tenderness to which she was so little accustomed. She looked up and smiled gratefully, though very feebly, then rose once more, took the musician's proffered arm, and allowed him to almost carry her whither he would. As they passed through the crowded hall, Beaujeu fortunately caught sight of Monsieur Legrand's tall figure and followed him at a distance until they reached the salon which had been arranged for the performers. Upon a dais raised at one end of the apartment stood various musical instruments and a number of velvet-covered armchairs. As each performer mounted the platform, Monsieur Legrand pointed out his or her place. Sylvie and her tutor he located in the least conspicuous position, if that term can be used where all positions were open to full observation. But Sylvie saw nothing of the gaily dressed spectators, and Beaujeu saw nothing but her. He was watching the strange flushing and paling of her cheeks, noting the whiteness of her quivering lips, The dilation of her large eyes, which gave her face a look of nightmare terror, as though she were praying to wake from some frightful dream. The concert opened with the noble overture from the opera of The Prophet. Sylvie had never heard it before. At the first few chords she drew a long breath, as though the air, which was stifling her, had suddenly grown light and clear. Her head turned involuntarily towards the performers, and her eyes were riveted upon them as if she took in the entrancing sound by her vision as well as by her hearing. A solo, duet, and trio followed. Her attention seemed wholly absorbed, and her countenance glowed with delight. Beaujeu held the program in his hand, but did not address her until the fourth performance concluded. Then he whispered, "It is now your turn, child." Monsieur Legrand approached and offered her his hand. Beaujeu did not dare to glance at her as she rose. Looking neither to the right nor the left, he walked to the piano and took his seat. A derisive murmur ran in and out among the musicians as Sylvie advanced to the front of the platform, and Leblanche took his place at her side, rapturously greeted by the audience. The rotundity of his proportions, the self-satisfaction, mingled with the native bonhomie expressed in his countenance, contrasted strongly with Sylvie's slender form, spirituelle look, and the bending humility of her appearance. But she had ceased to tremble. She had a true passion, an absolute veneration for music, and the masterly strains to which she had been listening had stirred her innermost soul, and left its finest chords still vibrating. The audience had all faded from her sight. Her perfect unconsciousness of self gave her self-possession. We pass over the effect produced by Leblanche's exquisite vocalization, which never failed to create enthusiasm. The very first notes, deep, rich, and clear, which issued from Sylvie's lips, took all ears captive, and caused a great hush. Her voice now gushed forth in wild flood, now softly rippled and rolled in waves of liquid sound, now floated and melted away in silvery echoes, and again the wonderful metamorphosis which we have before described took place. Her blue eyes, no longer frightfully dilated, filled with lustrous dew. The elastic lips lost their bloodless pallor, and took the most bewitching shape. The sallow cheeks were dyed with the softest blush. The drooping figure rose erect, and gained a startling height and majesty. She looked the very muse of song incarnate. Thunders of applause pealed around her at the close of the duet, but if she heard, she did not notice them, or comprehend that they were in any way a tribute to herself. The voice of Monsieur Legrand, congratulating her, broke the spell by which she was bound. Then she understood that she had passed the ordeal, that she had triumphed. She gave him one look of almost amazed gratitude, and, unconscious of the staring crowd, unmindful of the time and place, turned suddenly to her master, threw herself into his arms, and burst into tears. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. And the naturalness and spontaneity of the action elicited a tumultuous response from the sympathetic crowd. The clamor startled her. She lifted up her head and shrank away abashed. Maître Beaujeu, in spite of his own ill-concealed emotion, had enough presence of mind left to cover the awkwardness of her position and reconduct her to her seat. Monsieur Legrand shook him cordially by the hand, saying, "You have a treasure in your pupil, monsieur. I wish you joy. You may well be proud of her triumph tonight, and look forward for her to distinguish herself. I claim a little share of the honor myself because my esteem for you, my confidence in your judgment, has procured me the happiness of presenting her to the public. Monsieur Legrand, with his wonted shrewdness, foresaw that Sylvie's rare contralto voice and the passion, power, and skill she had evinced would render her a valuable addition to his corps, and by excessive suavity he hoped to efface the memory of his late mistrustful coldness. Bugeaud was only too ready to be flattered and conciliated. A number of the performers had gathered around Sylvie, but her face was covered with her hands. She still sobbed uncontrollably. "Really, mademoiselle," said Monsieur Legrand, "these should be tears of joy after your great success, but violent emotion will injure your beautiful voice. Your pupil is very nervous, Monsieur Bugeaud. You must be careful of her. I find excessive excitement very prejudicial to the vocal powers." Poor Sylvie! Tears of joy! Yes, perhaps they were, but they were tears that had their source in want and suffering, and hope deferred that made the heart sick, for these had rendered her physically so weak that she had no control over her emotion. The performance, which had been interrupted, now continued. Sylvie had only been engaged to sing in the duet with Leblanche, and solely to enable him to be heard. But Monsieur Legrand received a message from the Count, informing him that the audience desired to hear the young debutante once more. Maître Bugeaud feared that Sylvie could not regain sufficient composure to do herself justice, and objected, though very feebly, for he was sensible of the compliment. Legrand, who regarded the wish of the public as the law of an artist, would listen to no refusal, and Bugeaud, greatly perplexed, was forced to yield. He went up to Sylvie and took his seat by her side. She was still weeping immoderately.
"Sylvie, I never saw you cry before. It is very wrong, very childish. It will harm you. You must cease."
No answer, but renewed tears.
"Sylvie, you do not know that your trial is not over yet. You have more to accomplish tonight."
Her hands dropped from her face with the start she gave. "More?" was all she could ejaculate.
"Yes, you must sing again."
"Oh, my master! Impossible!"
"Possible, and to me," replied Bugeaud, resuming his usual stern manner. "The sooner you collect yourselves, the better, unless you wish to neutralize the effect you have produced. I tell you that you are to sing again at the conclusion of the concert. You will sing that beautiful closing air from the Somnambula, which I arranged to suit your voice."
Sylvie did not reply, but the shock communicated by this command checked the torrent of her tears. Maître Bugeaud said no more for some time, and she sat still, looking almost petrified, so suddenly had she been calmed. By and by, Bugeaud turned to her again.
"Well, Sylvie, will you be ready?"
"I fear I cannot sing."
"Cannot sing when the public requested?" answered Bugeaud, this time with unaffected savageness. "If you are the public servant, you must obey the public's orders. You must have no will, no pleasure, no indulgence of your own. That's the first lesson for you to learn. The harder lessons will follow. I tell you, the audience demands it, and you must sing."
Sylvie did not reply.
"Well, am I to have an answer? You must sing, I say."
Again she thought of the sacrificed violin. The inward struggle caused her flushed countenance to become ashy pale, but she looked up and said, "If you command me, I must make the attempt. Have I much time?"
Bugeaud examined the program. "There are 2 more pieces."
Not another word was uttered by either until the last song was concluded, and Bugeaud silently offered her his hand. Monsieur Legrand, however, pressed forward, and himself conducted her to the front of the platform. Then swelled loud acclamations from every side. She had created a sensation for which the audience had been wholly unprepared. The listeners were taken by storm. The atmosphere of mystery which surrounded her added to the charm. No one knew who she was, nor whence she came, but that she was a child of genius, was the unanimous verdict. As the boisterous greeting struck on her ears, Sylvie gave a frightened glance around, as though she was seeking some mode of escape. Maître Beaujeu whispered, "Sylvie," in a tone of rebuke that recalled her to herself. The glorious voice burst forth once again, as deep and rich and clarion-like as before, and Amina's joyful strain seemed the outburst of Sylvie's own internal happiness. Never was rapture more eloquently, more thrillingly made vocal. As the last silvery cadence died away, and before a conducting hand could be offered, she quietly returned to her seat. She had taken no heed of the enthusiastic plaudits. She was wholly unaware that an audience expect the stereotyped smiling obeisance with which musicians recognized every noisy token of approval. But the evident unsophistication evinced by her ignorance of the usual hackneyed style of receiving and courting public favor increased the strong impression of originality which she had already made upon the delighted spectators. Monsieur Legrand was loud in his compliments to both master and pupil, and Lablanche, with the generosity of a true artist, added his congratulations. The audience had risen. The singers, too, were departing. The Count had come forward with several of his friends and was standing by the steps of the platform. Legrand rightly conjectured that this group of admirers desired to be presented to the successful neophyte. In making the wished-for introduction, he courteously included Maître Beaujeu. Sylvie bowed with downcast eyes and could not syllable a single word in answer to the eulogiums showered upon her. Maître Beaujeu replied in her stead with really surprising tact and self-possession, but, seeing that her confusion every moment increased, he somewhat abruptly bade good evening and away. As they passed, the human stream parted and left a wake of murmured praises behind the twain. Once more in the library, Sylvie donned the shabby black mantilla, tied on the old lace veil, and though Legrand was conversing in an earnest tone with his humble associate, she took Maître Beaujeu's arm with empressement which showed her anxiety to depart. Beaujeu saw that her strength was nearly exhausted, and hastily making an appointment with Legrand for the morrow, conducted her into the hall, but was not destined to reach the street door as quickly as he anticipated. A young girl who might have passed for Titania of the beau monde, so fairy-like was her form, so aerial her presence, left the gentleman's arm upon which she was leaning, ran up to Sylvie, and took her hand, exclaiming, "Oh, mademoiselle, you have given us such true delight. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed your singing." Sylvie looked up at the sound of the fresh, girlish voice, and there was something in the joyous young face which inspired her with confidence and unsealed her lips. "I am so glad," she murmured, "but it was Maître Beaujeu." "Then we owe our thanks to him," answered the young lady's escort, bowing to the musician with a deference which showed that he could honor age and appreciate talent. "How pale and weary you look," remarked the beautiful girl, "and how cold your hand is. Are you very tired?" "I believe I am tired. I am so accustomed to—" Sylvie hesitated, not knowing how to finish the sentence properly. "Then we ought not to detain you longer, though I waylaid you on purpose to make you stay and talk with us." "Mademoiselle, you are very kind, and we are very flattered," replied Maître Beaujeu. "I fear my pupil, Mademoiselle Sylvie de la Roche, is more fatigued than she confesses.
She is not strong, and we have some distance to go. We will, therefore, beg you to pardon us, and allow us to say good evening."
"Good evening, then, but, Mademoiselle Sylvie, what a pretty name. I hope to hear you sing often. Oh, very, very often. Be sure I shall not forget you, and you must not forget me. Will you wear this little ring to remind you of that compact?" she added naively. "It is not worth presenting, but you will accept it and wear it for the sake of Honorine?"
She drew from her finger a gold ring, holding a heart-shaped ruby in the center, and placed it on the slender finger of Sylvie, who had removed her gloves, for they were saturated with tears. It was the first ring that had ever sparkled upon her hand. The gentleman whom Honorine had given her bouquet to hold selected a sprig of heliotrope, and, presenting it to Sylvie, said, in a tone of reverential admiration, "And will you not also accept this humble offering?"
"Mademoiselle, monsieur," replied Maître Bourgeot,
in a somewhat stately manner, for he was beginning to feel the importance of his position,
"my pupil is much honored by your approbation. You will allow me to thank you for her. Once more, good evening."
This time he succeeded in drawing Sylvie away, and they passed out of the door and down the steps, and were approaching the gate of the courtyard, when they heard a hurried footfall behind them. "Have you not a carriage waiting, Monsieur Bourgeot?" asked the gentleman from whom they had just departed. "I thought that you seemed pedestrianly disposed. I must insist upon your using my carriage. Antoine, drive up." Before Bourgeot could answer, the servant, obeying his master's orders, was at the gate, and the gaily dressed Choiseul dismounted, and let down the coach steps. The musician hesitated, but the young nobleman, for such the arms upon his coach panels proclaimed him to be, handed Sylvie into the carriage in a manner which precluded all discussion. Maître Bourgeot followed. "Give your orders to Antoine, Monsieur Bourgeot. I wish you good evening." Saying this, he withdrew, probably to save the music master the mortification of naming in his presence some very humble locality. The order to the Rue Saint-Denis, numero blank, was given, and the horses started at a rapid pace. "Oh, Maître Bourgeot!" exclaimed Sylvie. "How much I owe you!"
"You will repay the debt tenfold, child, if you continue to succeed. Therefore, gratitude need not oppress you."
"It does not. It is delightful to feel gratitude. How my father will rejoice, and my poor mother, and Mademoiselle Ursule, too. She seems so much interested. How bright all the world looks to me tonight. There is something exhilarating in the very air, something that mounts to my brain and almost makes my head light."
"The soft pressure of the first roses of triumph," replied Bourgeot. "But they are not thornless, child. We cannot hope for that. One only feels the dewy leaves at first, but the prick of thorns must also be experienced in time."
"Oh, doubtless, in time, exclaimed Sylvie merrily, "but not in anticipation, for that would be to experience it once more than is necessary. My dear master, do you know who the young lady is who spoke to us?" That was not precisely the question that rose to Sylvie's lips, but she changed her query before it found breath.
"No, but she is exceedingly lovely, though so diminutive, and she had the bearing of a little queen, a veritable reine de fées. The gentleman who escorted her has a most distinguished appearance. The coat of arms on his carriage shows that he is a nobleman."
"They are grand people, then? Very grand and high people?"
"Yes, you may be sure of that."
Sylvie sighed involuntarily. Maître Bougeot did not notice this inappropriate demonstration in answer to his assertion. His tongue was unloosed for the first time since Sylvie had known him, and he told her of the distinguished company he had played before in his youth, of the reverses he had met owing to the jealousy and treachery of his associates, and perhaps to his own lack of ability to push himself forward. He dwelt with much pathos upon his trials, his depression, his struggles to support his aged mother, and he pictured the hopes that sprang into existence at the discovery of Sylvie's talent, and which now promised to become tangible realities. The young maiden drank in every word, dreaming meanwhile of the golden future that might be in store for her needy master if the bright auguries of this night proved prophetic. She had almost reached an air castle over his head, which would have done credit to her father's ingenuity as a cloudland architect, when the carriage stopped. At the noise of the wheels, the concierge hastened to the door, but started back in amazement at the sight of a magnificent equipage, and coachman in rich livery, and a gorgeously attired chausseur. What was her bewilderment when the steps of the carriage were let down and Maître Bougeot descended and carefully handed out Sylvie. Old Dame Manot involuntarily crossed herself as though she felt under the influence of witchcraft. As Maître Bougeot passed her, hurrying Sylvie out, the dame could scarcely command breath to gasp out, "Mademoiselle Sylvie has great success at the concert, then?" "Certainly," replied Bougeot with his wonted brusqueness. "My pupil has achieved a single triumph. Have the goodness to stand aside." Dame Manot planted herself directly in their path. Maître Bougeot tried to hurry Sylvie on, but she kindly held out her hand to the old woman and said, "Thank you for being glad."
"Who told you she was glad?" asked Bougeot sharply. "Do you suppose poor people are ever glad to see other poor people rising above them? She is more likely to hate you than to like you better for your success. And as for rejoicing, bah, that's not in human nature."
"Then perhaps it's in angel nature," answered Sylvie gaily, hastening up the stair, "and I think there's enough of the angel in good Dame Manot for her to rejoice at my joy."
"Angel nature! Bah! A pretty pattern of an angel."
Sylvie was considerably in advance of her tutor. As she reached her own door, she nearly stumbled over a dark object that lay curled up close to the threshold. It stirred at her touch. "Is that you at last, Mademoiselle Sylvie?" asked Mathieu. "I must have fallen asleep. I have waited here so long. Have you triumphed? Is all well? Oh, tell me quickly." "They say that I have, good Mathieu. They say that I did Maître Bougeot credit." "And was it a grand place? And you wore my poor flowers all among the great people?" "Yes, I believe it was a very grand place, and I have the roses still in my hair, see?" And she threw off her veil and displayed the June roses drooping their heads among her rich braids. But the June rose that blossomed in her bosom when she went forth had been displaced, and there a sprig of heliotrope lay, but that she did not exhibit to Mathieu. Maître Bougeot came panting up the stairs.
"Who is that? Little rascal, is that you, lying in wait for Mademoiselle Sylvie as usual?"
At the sound of that voice, Mathieu vanished.
"Good night. Go to bed at once and rest," said Bougeot,
as Sylvie was about to open her own door. "Will you not come in to see how glad they will be?"
"No, they are sure to make fools of themselves, and I have abundant opportunities of beholding that exhibition."
Ursule was sitting with Monsieur and Madame de la Roche. At the sight of Sylvie's radiant face, they all rose. Her father caught her in his arms. "Victory! Victory!" he shouted. "She has triumphed! Did I not say that she would?"
Ursule and the mother wept for joy, for though Sylvie at first was unable to utter one word, her silence was as eloquent as the most profuse language. When she had been tenderly embraced and congratulated by each in turn, she found voice to reply to her father's manifold inquiries, and then related the events of the evening. But when she described the gracious young lady who placed the ring upon her finger, she wholly omitted to mention the noble-looking escort, nor did she allude to the odorous sprig of heliotrope he had so graciously presented her with. Perhaps the incident was so trifling that it escaped her memory. The rejoicing was interrupted by the sharp knock at the door, followed by the intrusion of Maître Bugeaud's sour face.
I say, you senseless people, unless you let the girl go to bed, she'll be ill tomorrow, and there will be another downfall of Monsieur de la Roche's pasteboard houses. She's worn out, and has a fever at this moment. Look at the bright spots on her cheek. As her master, I order my pupil to go to bed at once, and command her to talk no more tonight. Sylvie, I expect to be obeyed.
You shall be, my dear master. I do feel very much exhausted, and I am oppressively warm. As she spoke, her mother touched her hands and exclaimed in alarm, Oh, but they are burning! She'll have a fever and perhaps die! Oh dear! Good fortune never looks in upon us but to be scared away again. It will not stay to cheer us even for one night.
No wonder your endless croaking would put anything pleasant to flight, retorted Bugeaud. Give your daughter a cool drink and let her go instantly to bed, and if she should feel inclined to sleep in the morning, let her lie still. There ought to be no more chattering here tonight. Go to your own room, Mademoiselle Ursule.
Ursule, who had been easily awed by the morose musician, very meekly stole past him, carrying on her arm her old mantilla and veil. Bugeaud, as he withdrew, shook his head at Sylvie, repeating,
Go to bed at once.
Her mother, whose fears were only too readily excited, urged the not unwilling Sylvie to obey. The father talked on long after he retired, driving his magnificent greys for the greater part of the night, but the imaginary steeds and their fancied owner were now and then brought to a sudden halt by his wife's dolorous ejaculation, Suppose she has a fever! There will be the end of all our hopes. Did we suggest that the flower worn in Sylvie's bosom might have escaped her recollection? That must have been an error, for the roses she took from her hair were left to wither forgotten upon her little toilette table, but the heliotrope was tenderly laid between the leaves of her Bible. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Mute Singer by Anna Cora MOWATT RITCHIE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 5 The Ruby Ring. An exhausting exertion that is pleasurable, that calls in play the capabilities of the spirit which, when they rise to the heights of genius, ever clamor for a burst of action, usually leaves no lasting sense of prostration, and then youth has wondrous recuperative powers. Sylvie rose refreshed the next morning, and free from every lingering trace of fever. Madame de la Roche, with trembling solicitude, felt her hands and counted her pulse over and over again, but she was forced to admit that the hands were cool and the pulse temperate, and that her daughter never looked so well or so happy. The frugal breakfast was unusually prolonged that morning. Sylvie seemed serenely joyful, and her father boisterously exultant, while her mistrustful mother looked positively frightened when she caught herself sharing their gaiety. Monsieur de la Roche would gladly have remained at home all day to talk over Sylvie's triumph and lay plans for the future, but he had promised the notary to complete some important copying. And besides, he longed to inform his patron that he might provide himself immediately with a new assistant. Fortunate circumstances would place his present copyist above the need of pursuing his humble vocation. After her father had gone forth, Sylvie, instead of clearing away the breakfast, remained seated, contemplating her own hand as it lay upon the table before her. "What ails you, Sylvie?" inquired the mother. "I fear you are fatigued. After all, you are only just beginning to feel it. That often happens, and the fever may come yet." "Oh, no danger. Is it not pretty, mother?" "Pretty? A fever? No, I think not." "How wildly you talk! I really believe you are getting light-headed." Sylvie laughed and held up her hand. "I never imagined it would be so pleasant to have a ring on one's finger. But the ring must come off, though that kind young lady charged me to wear it for her sake. It must be put to a better use." "What is the child talking about? She certainly is delirious. Part with your first token of public approval? Put it to a better use? Surely you are out of your head." "The ring must bring back Maître Bougeot's violin. That violin is more important to my dear master than the ring is to me." "But you do not propose to sell your ring?" "No, only exchange it for the violin. I think I know at what pawnbroker Maître Bougeot left his instrument in pledge. I cannot form an estimate of the value of this ring, but it may possibly be worth the 70 francs Maître Bougeot raised on his old violin." "But you cannot get the violin without Maître Bougeot's ticket. Don't you know that, simpleton?" "I suppose the ticket will be required of me by the pawnbroker, but Maître Bougeot certainly will not give it up for the purpose of making the exchange. But I mean to try what I can do. Do you not remember Maître Bougeot said he went to a pawnbroker's near here? Let me go there with Mademoiselle Ursule. I will tell the whole story to the person who is in charge of the business. Mademoiselle Ursule will testify to the truth of my relation, and I will plead so warmly that possibly I may get the exchange made." "You will get nothing for your pains, but I suppose the only way to satisfy you is to let you try, and I am dreadfully afraid of the fever's coming on if you should fret. So go and try what you can do, but make up your mind not to worry because you are refused a very unreasonable request." Sylvie quickly availed herself of her mother's permission to make the experiment. Ursule consented to accompany her, and they were soon on their way to the office. It was some time before they could get any satisfactory answer to their inquiries, but at last the man to whom they applied admitted that Maître Bougeot's violin had been pledged there. Sylvie showed her ring, and cupidity sparkled in his eyes at the sight of the magnificent ruby. The ring was not only more valuable than the violin, but an article far more easily disposed of if it chanced not to be redeemed at the specified time. Sylvie told her story with an earnest simplicity which was full of eloquence, but her listener, though strongly tempted, was unwilling to agree to the unbusinesslike arrangement of giving up the violin without the ticket. Sylvie pleaded with irresistible warmth. A long consultation between the partners ensued. At last the violin was yielded up and the ring left in its place on the condition that Maître Bougeot's ticket was returned before the night. Great was her mother's astonishment when Sylvie returned, carrying the violin, very much after the fashion that a young girl carries a baby, and laid it as tenderly on the table as Maître Bougeot himself would have done. She hardly arranged the room, taken her seat at the piano and warbled a few notes when Maître Bourgeot's knock was heard at the door. She cried out, "Enter!" without looking around.
"Ah, little owl, up and playing the nightingale again? That's well. That shows you have more stamina than your looks imply. But what's this?"
He stopped immediately in front of the table. "What is it?" "Why, your violin, my master," answered Sylvie demurely. "Do you not recognize your old friend? In return for it, you will just be good enough to hand me the ticket the pawnbroker gave you. It's mine." Maître Bourgeot was not listening. He had opened the case of the violin. He was looking at the precious instrument. He took it up. He almost hugged it. His breast heaved tumultuously. A sound like the rushing of waves issued from his lips as he drew the bow across the strings, which responded as the voice of their own to his emotion. Sylvie stood beside him, too respectful and too much touched to break the silence. But her mother, who anticipated an explosion of wrath, exclaimed, "Sylvie did it! I told her she had better not. I told her it was no business of hers, but the wilful girl would have her own way."
"How did she obtain possession of my property? How did she dare to meddle with my affairs?" asked Bourgeot, recovering himself in his roughest tone. "Those villainous pawnbrokers! How could they have the hardihood to entrust what was mine to another, without my order? I shall go to them at once. I'll teach them a lesson."
"You will not do anything so wrong, my dear master," answered Sylvie quietly. "I am the only one to blame. Was I not right to repay my debt the very first moment that I could?"
"But what you could not, that's the difficulty. By what means of repaying it had you?"
Sylvie did not reply. She was intimidated by the severity of his look.
"Do you intend to answer me?"
"You had a violin. It was your sole valuable. I had a ring. It was my sole valuable. You gave up your violin for me. I gave up my ring for you. Surely the barter is a fair one, and simple enough. There's nothing very wonderful about the transaction."
"And do you suppose that this is the use you are to make of gifts bestowed upon you by high people? Do you know what consequences this may lead? Do you know what will be thought of you if you do not wear the token of esteem which a young lady of rank has conferred upon you?"
"I shall wear it, Maître Bourgeot, by and by. I hope to redeem it. Do you forget that a new path is open to me, thanks to your unwearied instructions, and that I shall be able to earn my bread?"
"How confident we have grown all of a sudden! One swallow does not make a summer. There is a vast difference between one night's triumph and the steady maintaining of your position."
"Ah, there is," ruefully responded Madame de la Roche. "I said we were rejoicing too soon, crowing before dawn. Sylvie's just like her poor father, takes everything for granted, and has found a fortune if she picks up a sou."
"You almost make me wish she might never find anything that would rob you of the satisfaction of perpetual whining," snarled Bourgeot.
"Maître Bourgeot, my mother," began Sylvie.
There, that's enough about it, child. I am going to give back the violin at once, and to get your ring. I suppose two can play at that game."
Sylvie's countenance changed. She looked not merely sad, but hurt, and answered with dignity that became her well, "Of course, you will do as you please, but it will wound me deeply. I have no right to dictate to someone who is vastly my superior. I am your debtor in all senses of the word, but if you would allow me the pleasure of feeling the first faint foreshadowing touch of an independence which I may hereafter obtain, you will keep your violin and give me the ticket, which I have promised to carry to the man who, through my representations, gave up the violin against his better judgment." Bugeaud looked at her steadily for a moment, and if he did not smile, it was because he would not. There was a smile lurking in his eyes, which he forced away from his hard lips. He took a long pinch of snuff and replaced the box, drew out a little old, discolored pocketbook, deliberately selected the ticket, threw it on the table, seized his violin, turned on his heel, and, without a word, left the room. When Sylvie and Ursule presented themselves again at the pawnbroker's, the sight of the ticket gave evident relief to the person whom Sylvie had argued into an irregular proceeding, which might have entailed unpleasant results. Sylvie now received a ticket for the ruby ring that had been left in pledge and departed well pleased. Maître Bugeaud returned some hours later. Sylvie at once remarked the satisfied air with which he took a seat, laying his violin on his knees, and rested his hands upon the case.
"I have seen Monsieur Legrand. I had an appointment with him, which I have just kept."
"Yes, I am glad."
"How do you know there is any cause for gladness?"
"Your eyes told me. They talk faster than your tongue, my master."
"You will oblige me by not consulting my eyes, then. It's not decorous conduct for a young girl. Monsieur Legrand has offered you an engagement. You don't look in the least astonished."
"I knew it before."
"That is not possible. How could you know it?"
"Your eyes told me that, too. They are great telltales."
"Do you want to put me into a passion with your impertinence?"
"Sylvie, my dear, do behave reasonably. You don't know what might happen if you did put Maître Bugeaud into one of his rages," broke in the mother. Bugeaud had seated himself with his back to Madame de la Roche, who was sewing as usual at the window. He now wheeled abruptly around to face her. He was evidently on the point of giving vent to some violent outburst, but Sylvie laid her hand gently on his arm. The soft touch and her look of entreaty melted him. Without uttering a syllable, but with a great gulp, which seemed to swallow down many words, he wheeled round again. "Monsieur Legrand has offered us an engagement," remarked Sylvie, by way of taking up the thread of the discourse.
"That's right, child. Say, us. He has offered us another appearance," replied Bugeaud proudly. "He either thought it time to recognize my ability, or policy has induced him to show me some deference on your account. He has requested 3 songs from you, of my selection, and a solo on the violin from me. The concert, which he is now making arrangements, is to take place at the Salle Saint-Cécile, not at a private house as before." A light shadow passed over Sylvie's face at the last words. Of what was she thinking? Why would she have preferred to sing again at the Count Castellane's? "Legrand has the whole management, including the payment of the artist."
"And he proposes to pay us?" asked Sylvie.
200 francs,
answered Bugeaud, with ill-affected coolness. 200 francs? That's immense."
"No, it's very moderate remuneration. But you are a novice and have yet to earn celebrity. One is paid for reputation rather than for positive talent. Of the 200 francs, 100 will be yours."
No, indeed, that would be unfair. Have you not instructed me for 3 years? My share must be very small. I will receive only enough to supply the immediate wants of my parents. The rest rightfully belongs to you."
"Am I henceforth to be schooled by you? Are you to set up your judgment on all occasions against mine? I see you have plenty of spirit that will come out by and by and play the deuce with us. I tell you, I will make what agreement I please, and you will consent to it, whether it please you or displease you. Am I not the master, and are you not my pupil? Perhaps you desire to change places. Or you would like to have some other master to deal with?
Can you think I could so forget what I owe you?
The first thing you owe me is obedience, and that's a debt I advise you to pay. Since we've settled that matter, now let us select the 3 songs.
End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Mute Singer by Cora, RITCHIE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Second Step. The week that intervened between her first and second appearance as a singer did not pass very smoothly with Sylvie. The constant presence of her volatile father was not merely an interruption to her studies, but his frequent wordy collisions with Beaujeu discomposed her and kept her choleric master in a state of most distressing excitement. De la Roche was in such exuberant spirits, he was so confident that Sylvie's talents would speedily realize a large income, that he would shortly be restored to his former position in the social world, and glorious anticipation that he would ere long actually drive that superb pair of greys which were always careering through his brain, that he grew more reckless and improvident than ever. The few francs per day which he had an opportunity of earning seemed a sum too petty to be considered. To receive them would, he thought, be a positive humiliation, and, in a stately manner, he declined to undertake any further copying for the notary. He now passed the larger portion of his time at home, commenting on his daughter's studies, vociferously applauding her brilliant execution, rallying his wife upon her low spirits, sparring with Maître Beaujeu, and communicating to everyone who entered his princely projects for the future. Ursule flitted in and out of the room at brief intervals, always shrinking into some corner or stealing noiselessly away when Beaujeu made his appearance. Mathieu, uncured by the musician's rough treatment of his propensity to hearken by stealth to sweet sounds, never passed the door without lingering to listen, and as Sylvie's voice threw its witching spell around him, he often sank down enthralled, and with his head resting against the door panel, became oblivious of his errand, forgetting all of his wants, his cares, his misery, until a well-known step dissolved the enchantment, and put his visions and himself to flight. Madame Manot, the concierge, who, ever since she had seen Sylvie descend from the splendid carriage, had paid great court to the De la Roches, and gossiped about them incessantly, made continual visits to their apartment, accompanied by curious friends. De la Roche received her with pompous condescension, and amazed the good woman by his florid descriptions of the mode of life he proposed shortly to lead, and his enumeration of the sumptuous adornments of the abode he was busily preparing in his imagination. Unluckily, this troublesome father had made up his mind not to forego the pleasure of witnessing his daughter's next triumph in public, and upon that point he was immovable. He coolly made known his determination to accompany her to the salle. This privilege Beaujeu refused to allow, and even threatened to give up his instructions and the engagement altogether if De la Roche persisted in his intention. Then Everard proposed to buy a ticket, and if he had possessed or could have borrowed the requisite amount, it would have been expended in this purchase, and that while the sweet singer herself almost lacked food. At last Beaujeu, tired out by these persecutions, procured from Monsieur Legrand a complimentary admission, which he presented to De la Roche, on the condition that he absented himself from his lodgings during the day. The bargain was easily made, and so great was the father's joy at the possession of the ticket that he may be said to have worn it next to his heart, and certainly he drew it forth and gazed upon it tenderly hundreds of times, besides exhibiting it to every acquaintance whom he encountered during the 3 days that elapsed before it could be used. The evening came. Sylvie was clad in the simple snowy raiment that she had before worn. She had no means of replacing the white kid gloves, which had been completely ruined by her abundant tears. But the thoughtful Ursule had provided her with another pair, stinting herself for a week after for the pleasure of indulging in this helpful generosity. Vaillant had not forgotten a meet tribute to the Saint Cecilia of Song, at whose shrine he worshipped so devoutly. His offering was a bunch of lilies of the valley, and the pure white bells, drooping among Sylvie's jetty hair, increased by contrast the beauty of the flowers, and of the silken tresses upon which they reposed. Beaujeu artfully advised De la Roche to present himself at the doors of the salle some time before they opened, that he might secure an advantageous seat. His real object was to get him out of the way as soon as possible. The ruse succeeded admirably. The impatient father acted so promptly upon the hint that, after solitarily pacing up and down before the Salle Sainte-Cécile for an hour, he headed the long queue, which, according to the French custom, forms the crowd at an entrance into an orderly double file, no one person pressing before another who arrived earlier. De la Roche's effervescent spirits forbade all reticence, and he soon entered into conversation with the persons who surrounded him. After the opening of a few general remarks, he confidentially informed them that he had a daughter who was to sing that night. He dwelt with enthusiasm upon the genius she evinced and upon her success at the Count Castellane's recent concert, then branched off into his discourse and favored his listeners with a sketch of his ancestry and his own early history, gave them an account of his wealth and his losses, and finally communicated his conviction that his fortunes were now to be redeemed by the daughter whom they were about to behold. Wrapped once more in Ursule's foxy black mantle and old veil, Sylvie walked with her master to the salle in the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin. The little retiring room appropriated to the singers was a rather comfortless apartment, but Sylvie felt more at home there than in the Count's elegant library. Monsieur Legrand had saluted her and Beaujeu when they entered, with marked courtesy, and his example was followed by such of the performers as were present at her debut. The arrangements were, of course, different from those in a private house. The musicians only appeared when, according to the order indicated by the program, it was their turn to sing or play. Sylvie was perfectly composed and apparently absorbed in the duty to be discharged. She sat beside Beaujeu, now and then exchanging a few words with him, until Monsieur Legrand gave her his hand to lead her forth. It had not occurred to her master that she should be instructed to return the greeting of the audience by an obeisance, and she walked directly, though calmly, to the front of the platform near the piano. There were many persons present who had already heard her sing, and, noisy as was their welcome, it was unnoticed by the young vocalist. Monsieur Legrand whispered to her, "You have forgotten to curtsy, mademoiselle. Curtsy, if you please." Sylvie looked up at his face with surprise, but supposing that he meant her to curtsy to him, made a modest reverence. The quickness with which the audience comprehended this little byplay, divined what Legrand had whispered, and how the unsophisticated girl had misinterpreted his words, was surprising. A good-humored and very general laugh, mingled with plaudits, resounded from every side. But Sylvie, far from being conscious that she had committed any error, inwardly congratulated herself that she had so quickly acted upon Monsieur Legrand's hint. O mio Fernando, from Donizetti's opera of La Favorita, was executed with artistic skill, depth of feeling, and vocal power rarely equaled. One great charm of her singing was the absence of all effort, the flowing forth of the delicious sounds as though they involuntarily rolled from her lips. The tumultuous burst of delight which rent the air when the last mellow notes faded into silence did not seem to reach her ears. From the moment she commenced singing, her countenance wore an abstracted, dreamy look, as though she had risen to some sublimer sphere, and was unaware of all that passed in the region below her. It was quite useless for Monsieur Legrand again to suggest the propriety of a courteous acknowledgment. He led her back to the retiring room without a word, and regardless of the uproarious demand for an encore. "You sang charmingly, Mademoiselle de la Roche," he then said to her, "but you quite forgot to salute the audience." "Salute the audience? Oh, I beg pardon. I did not know that I had anything to do with the audience," answered the novice. Those artless words drew forth little gushes of suppressed laughter from her associates of the hour. "Yes, little stupid," said Beaujeu, coming to the rescue. "You must curtsy when you appear before them, and curtsy when you retire. But I will not allow curtsying at every demonstration of favor. That is a shocking Italian habit in the worst possible taste, and it does not suit your purer style." As he spoke, he darted spiteful glances at several of the ladies, who were still giggling in their handkerchiefs, and whom he had beheld soliciting fresh rounds of applause by a ready bending of the knee at the faintest sound of approval. Monsieur Legrand, who heard, shrugged his shoulders and converted a spontaneous grimace into a conciliatory smile. He thought it better not to interfere with the eccentric pair. He had remarkable skill in feeling the public's pulse, and he knew that Sylvie's very freshness and unaffected ignorance of forms added to the potent charm of her marvelous vocalization. When she appeared again, she did not forget the important salutation, and the marked manner in which she curtsied seemed archly to say, "If I did wrong before, I hope I am atoning." Such, too, was the ready interpretation of her action by the spectators, and her perfect transparency increased her fascination. But while she was singing Voi chi sapete from Mozart's Figaro, her recent tutoring was wholly effaced from her mind, and at the close of the air she was gravely walking away when some recollection seemed to strike her. She started, hesitated, came back a step or two with, "Oh, I forgot," plainly expressed by her countenance, made her little, untaught, rustic courtesy, and tripped away, followed by a whirlwind of rapturous acclamation. Even the bombastic Legrand smiled and almost laughed. Before Sylvie sang the third time, her master was to execute a solo. Maître Beaujeu took unusually long to tune his dear, sweet-toned violin, but he would have flown into a rage if anyone had dared to hint that he was at all ruffled. When he rose, Sylvie followed him, and begged that she might stand where she could hear. Beaujeu stationed her a few steps from the entrance to the stage, where she was screened from view. But as the music grew more and more stirring, it seemed to draw her magnetically forth. Little by little, she unconsciously advanced, bending forward to catch every sound. She did not see the audience. She did not know that anyone saw her, but stood, rapt and statue-like, almost breathlessly listening, while all eyes were riveted upon her. The hearty tokens of pleasure that echoed on every side, when the strain ended, were awarded as much to the affectionate enthusiasm of the pupil as to the masterly skill of the tutor. She remained as motionless as one transfixed, until Beaujeu approached her in making his exit. His surprise, "What are you doing here, child?" first made her aware that she was standing in the presence of the crowd. She drew back aghast, striking in the suddenness of her retreat against Monsieur Legrand, who chanced to be standing behind her. He accosted her laughingly. "Mademoiselle Laroche, your appreciation of your master does you as much honor as your devotion to your art." Di Tanti Palpiti, composed for Pasta's glorious contralto voice, had been selected for Sylvie's last effort that night, and, startling as her vocal achievements had been before, this was her crowning triumph. Monsieur Legrand was obliged to consent to the encore, which was vociferously demanded, and, even after the request had been complied with, found it difficult to quiet and satisfy the enraptured and exciting auditors, who appeared determined to hear the air for a third time, and not to allow the performance to proceed in regular order until they were gratified. That Sylvie was able to sustain herself now was an incontestable fact. That she must take rank with the first singers of the day appeared to be a sequence which nothing could prevent. That Monsieur Legrand entertained this opinion was evidence from his deference towards her, which every moment augmented. The concert was over. Sylvie and her master had only made a few steps in the street when her quick eyes distinguished two persons approaching that made her heart give a great bound. That tiny, graceful, nymph-like little figure, and the stately form by its side, had too often risen before her mental vision not to be instantly recognized. "We are more captivated than ever, Mademoiselle Sylvie. I am sure the great Pasta never sang Di Tanti Palpiti more triumphantly," said Honorine. "You have not forgotten me, I hope?" Honorine had taken Sylvie's hand. It trembled nervously at the touch. Sylvie was thinking of the ruby ring with a sickening fear that its absence from her finger might be detected. She remembered all Maître Beaujeu had said about what might be thought of her parting with the ring, and knew she could not defend herself. Despite the thrill of joy that ran quivering through every vein at this encounter, she was impatient to hasten away, and could not command her voice. "Those clouds yonder look threatening," remarked Honorine's escort. "You must allow us to take you home." Sylvie made a faint effort to decline this offer, but Beaujeu thought of the likelihood of her taking cold, and the chances that her voice might be affected by hoarseness, and answered promptly, "You are exceedingly good, monsieur. We will accept your offer, for a cold would be a terrible calamity just at this moment." "It would be indeed," replied the nobleman, handing Sylvie into the carriage. "One that would fall upon us all." Honorine leaped lightly in, and the gentleman followed. The former chatted merrily to Sylvie as the carriage was on its way to the Rue Saint-Denis, and the young singer was gradually lured into unembarrassed responses. It was too dark for her to distinguish the faces around her, and that circumstance helped to banish her diffidence. The gentlemen conversed with each other, and the nobleman gave Maître Beaujeu his opinion of the concert as a whole and of individual performers, not forgetting the solo on the violin, and proving by his discriminating criticism that he was a fine judge of music. Sylvie had become quite at ease with her aristocratic companion by the time the carriage stopped. Maître Beaujeu was nearest to the door. He got out and turned to assist his pupil, but the nobleman sprang down the steps, seriously handed her out himself. Then, without once glancing at the humble locality, re-entered the coach. Dame Manot flew forth at the sound of the wheels, and various lodgers put out their heads out of the doors and windows to see if it really was little Sylvie brought home in a grand carriage. And we fear that some of them dreamt dreams that night about renouncing their own humble vocations to turn their attentions to music as the easiest means of rising in the world. The delighted concierge caught Sylvie enthusiastically in her arms, but this familiarity exasperated Maître Beaujeu, who almost tore her from the good woman's hearty embrace. He bade Sylvie good night at her own door. He ordered her to go to bed at once. The command, however, was not obeyed, for, naturally, she had to relate the occurrences of the evening to her mother and Ursule. Very soon her father burst in upon the trio, and incoherently poured out the history of his adventures. He repeated the flattering remarks he had overheard, the congratulations he had received when it was known that he was Sylvie's father, told of the whispers that flew from one to another, until quite a large circle was cognizant of the fact, and described his efforts to elbow his way through the crowd that he might accompany his daughter home, and his perfectly furious struggles to reach her side when he saw her enter a superb carriage, which some of the spectators recognized as the equipage of the Marquis de Saint-Amand. "The Marquis de Saint-Amand!" ejaculated Sylvie. "And the lovely little lady who was with him, did you hear who she was?" "Oh, I think that was Madame de la Marquise, of course. I think I heard someone call her so. It is a great honor for her to bring you home herself, but nothing more than what we have the right to expect." Sylvie suddenly grew pale and stammered out, "I fancied she was too young to be married, and she seemed so girlish and frank. It never occurred to me. I could not have believed. It does not seem possible." None of these broken sentences were to be finished. She appeared to be lost in thought and was too absent to hear her father's questions. When he chided her jestingly, mingling his light rebukes with kisses and praise, she pleaded fatigue and begged to leave to retire to her chamber. A moment before she had declared that she was not in the least degree tired and felt as though she could sing all night. But we suppose there is no exception to the rule that pronounces women capricious, since one brought up in such seclusion and so indulged as Sylvie invents caprice. End of Chapter 6.